Hey guys, tonight we slip straight into the candlelit glow of a medieval banquet hall. You picture it already, don't you? Long wooden tables, bowing under the weight of roasted boars, steaming venison, and enough drumsticks to fuel an army of knights. The myth goes that upper-class medieval parties were basically endless meat parades, like a Renaissance fair buffet on steroids. You imagine yourself gnawing on turkey legs the size of baseball bats, grease dripping down your chin, and maybe even a jug of ale in your other hand. Sounds delicious, right? Well, brace yourself, because the shocking truth is a little less Game of Thrones feast and a lot more quirky reality check. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle in, expecting the upper class of the Middle Ages to live in a non-stop meat lover's paradise. But here's the flip. While nobles did love their meat, it wasn't the never-ending carnivore carnival you've been told. In fact, most of the time, the variety of meats was smaller than you think, and some of the stranger delicacies might make you push your plate away. Let's start with the mainstream fact. Medieval banquets weren't daily events. They were reserved for big occasions: weddings, coronations, religious feasts. On an average Tuesday, nobles might have bread, cheese, and a modest cut of salted meat, not a whole roasted stag, your fantasy buffet, more like a Sunday special. Now, here's the quirky tidbit. One popular dish wasn't meat at all, but a meat asterisk illusion. Chefs loved crafting pies that looked like venison, but were filled with, wait for it, minced fruit, spiced eggs, or even fish. Imagine biting into what looks like roast beef and getting a mouthful of sweet raisins. Surprise! Medieval meat was sometimes as fake as a modern plant-based burger. And the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether nobles ate more meat than ordinary folk, or if that's just legend blown up by storytellers. Some records show vast hunting estates supplying nobles with venison, while others suggest preservation problems and religious fasting days meant nobles couldn't gorge on meat as often as the myths suggest. Of course, the image of endless meat stuck, probably because bragging about giant roasts made you sound powerful. Who wouldn't want to say, oh yes, last night's supper was an entire swan stuffed with another bird, which was stuffed with yet another bird. Yes, the medieval version of the turducken was real. It was like nesting dolls, but with feathers and gravy. And here's your punchline. While you imagine walking away from a noble feast with the meat sweats, the truth is you'd probably leave hungry for something green. Because if you think nobles skipped veggies altogether, well, that's the myth we'll poke fun at later. Oh, and remember, no matter how fancy the feast looked, forks weren't really a thing yet. You'd be elbow deep in grease, gnawing bones like a medieval raccoon. Romantic, isn't it? So next time you imagine a banquet of endless meat, picture less of a 24/7 carnivore festival and more of an occasional over-the-top cheat day, sprinkled with culinary pranks. You lean back, imagining those goblets of medieval nobility overflowing with the finest vintages. The myth paints nobles practically swimming in wine-ruby red rivers of Bordeaux cascading down their throats. Silver goblets, never once empty. If you walked into a banquet hall, you'd expect tipsy nobles clinking glasses every 5 seconds, maybe even dunking bread in their cups like it's fondue. But here comes the flip. While wine was indeed a status symbol, what sloshed around inside those goblets wasn't always the refined, romantic drink you're picturing. Think of this. If you traveled back in time expecting to taste a silky Merlot, you'd probably spit it out faster than you could say sommelier. Medieval wine was rough, sour, and often cut with honey, spices, or even herbs to mask its farmyard bouquet. Imagine grabbing a fine glass of Cabernet, only to realize it tastes like vinegar with cinnamon. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Most nobles did drink wine daily, but not because it was luxurious. It was safer than water, which was often riddled with bacteria. In fact, children drank watered-down wine, too, because, well, it was the medieval version of a juice box. Now, for the quirky tidbit. Sometimes nobles literally drank beer soup in the mornings. Yes, beer soup hot, beer thickened with bread, eggs, or butter. Can you picture starting your day with a steaming mug of foamy stew? Starbucks wouldn't survive a minute in medieval Europe. And here's where historians bicker. Did nobles prefer wine or ale? Southern Europe leaned heavily on wine, thanks to vineyards, but Northern Europe had stronger beer traditions. Some records suggest noble preference was a class divide: wine to show off sophistication, ale for practicality. But scholars still argue how much of that was cultural snobbery versus actual taste. Joke number 1. Imagine ordering a medieval bottle service, except instead of chilled champagne, a servant brings you lukewarm mead in a wooden bucket. Very Instagrammable, right? Joke number 2. Nobles spiced their wine with herbs like rosemary or sage. So if you accidentally spilled your drink, congratulations, you just invented medieval salad dressing. Joke number 3. Nobles drank so much watered-down wine that you'd swear they were just hydrating with fancy Kool-Aid. But here's your punchline. Yes, goblets were full, but half the time they were full of what we'd call today DIY kombucha. Experiments gone wrong. So while the myth says nobles drowned in rivers of fine wine, the truth is they were just trying not to choke on their own medieval Gatorade. And remember that fake meat pie from before? Imagine washing it down with a goblet of spicy vinegar. You wouldn't know whether you'd been served dinner or a prank. You step further into the flickering banquet hall, convinced that every medieval upper-class party was basically a royal gala, kings at the head of the table, queens in glittering gowns, and a parade of servants bowing so low they practically dusted the floor with their foreheads. The myth insists that nobles feasted like royalty every night, each meal as extravagant as a coronation. You picture yourself sitting just a few seats away from the king himself, casually passing the salt like your best buddies. But here's the flip. Most upper-class parties weren't royal spectacles at all. In fact, a banquet often looked more like an upscale networking event than a non-stop fairy tale. Let's get the mainstream fact straight. Kings and queens didn't attend every noble's party. Royals had their own enormous feasts, sure, but your average count or duke wasn't breaking bread with the monarch every week. Most noble gatherings were hosted to show off wealth to local peers, cement alliances, or celebrate a family milestone. Think of it less as a royal coronation and more like that awkward office Christmas party with too much fruitcake. Here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes nobles actually hired actors to play kings in mock coronations during their parties. Imagine renting a discount king for the night, complete with a paper crown and fake scepter, all just to wow your guests. That's medieval cosplay at its finest. And now, the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these mock royalty parties were widespread displays of political loyalty or just over-the-top entertainment. Some see them as harmless fun, while others suspect they were symbolic gestures meant to butter up the actual monarchy. After all, if word got back to the real king that you threw a fake coronation, you'd better hope he laughed instead of sharpened his sword. Joke number 1. Picture yourself showing up at a noble's banquet, expecting King Henry, only to find Dave the baker, dressed in a crown, waving awkwardly while chewing bread. Joke number 2. Nobles couldn't casually stream royal appearances on Instagram, so they basically made their own fan conventions. Medieval Comic-Con, but with more swans on platters. Joke number 3. Imagine playing Pin the Crown on the King as the after-dinner game. The punchline. Medieval upper-class parties weren't daily royal affairs. They were carefully staged spectacles designed to make you think royalty was near, even if the closest thing to a king was an underpaid actor in a wig. So while the myth pictures endless royal banquets, the truth is, nobles spent half their time pretending their feasts were grander than they actually were. And remember those goblets of sour, spiced wine from the last section. Now picture offering that vinegar brew to your discount king. If he could keep a straight face, he deserved a real crown. You settle deeper into the scene, convinced that nobles lived entirely on meat mountains of beef, rivers of pork, towers of poultry, like medieval carnivores who had never even heard of broccoli. The myth says vegetables were for peasants, the sad scraps grown in muddy gardens, while lords and ladies feasted on roast after roast. You picture nobles glaring at a carrot the way a modern teenager glares at homework. But here comes the flip. Vegetables weren't just present, they were sneaky little stars in many dishes, though not always in the way you'd expect. Mainstream fact. First, nobles did eat vegetables, especially in stews and pies, but they weren't the main attraction. Veggies were often cooked down, blended with meat, or disguised by spices. You'd find onions, leeks, and cabbage hiding under piles of venison, like the sidekick in a superhero movie, always there, but never in the spotlight. Quirky tidbit. Medieval cooks loved to use herbs and greens as asterisk decorations. Imagine your dinner arriving with a garnish of parsley, so gigantic it looked like a houseplant. In some cases, whole vegetables were carved into strange shapes or dyed with natural pigments to make the feast look more colorful. It was medieval food styling, long before Instagram and the debate. Historians still argue about how much plant-based food nobles actually ate. Some accounts suggest meat-dominated noble diets, while others highlight the importance of legumes, grains, and vegetables, especially during fasting days when meat was forbidden. Was it truly a meat-centered world, or just a story inflated by feasting records? The jury's still out. Joke number 1. Imagine a noble's horror if you offered him a kale smoothie. He'd probably call the guards and accuse you of sorcery. Joke number 2. Nobles considered vegetables low class, yet they slurped pea porridge like it was the medieval version of instant ramen. Joke number 3. Fancy chefs sometimes dyed vegetables bright colors, so if you thought rainbow bagels were trendy, congratulations, medieval nobles beat you to it. The punchline: upper-class parties weren't pure carnivore carnivals. They were more like heavily spiced potlucks, with vegetables lurking in the background, sometimes disguised, sometimes celebrated, and occasionally dressed up like circus performers. And remember those fake meat pies stuffed with raisins we talked about earlier? Well, imagine slicing into one and finding surprise peas and carrots. Turns out nobles were getting their veggies, whether they admitted it or not. You shuffle closer to the high table, picturing a cozy scene: nobles, peasants, servants, and knights all clinking cups together in a jolly medieval version of Thanksgiving dinner. The myth paints one big happy family, a class-free buffet where everyone grabbed a plate, sat where they liked, and shared a laugh over swan stew. Sounds heartwarming, right? Well, time for the flip. Medieval upper-class parties weren't kumbaya potlucks. Seating was more rigid than airline boarding groups, and where you sat literally defined your worth. Here's the mainstream fact: banquet halls had strict seating charts. The host and the highest-ranking guests sat at the high table, usually on a raised platform. From there, the status trickled down row by row, like medieval Wi-Fi with terrible signal strength. If you were low-ranking, you were pushed further from the action, and sometimes you weren't even allowed inside the main hall. Imagine being invited to a party and discovering your seat is in the hallway by the drafty door. Now for the quirky tidbit: sometimes nobles actually seated dogs closer to the high table than low-ranking humans. Yes, fancy hunting hounds could get premium scraps while you gnawed on stale bread in the corner. Picture yourself glaring at a drooling greyhound sitting on a cushion while you beg for gravy. And the debate. Historians still argue whether strict seating arrangements were about enforcing hierarchy or simply practical crowd control. Some records show harsh enforcement of rank-like servants tackling anyone who dared sit too close to the lord, while others suggest feasts had more flexibility depending on the occasion. So were seating charts medieval snobbery or just medieval logistics? The jury's split. Joke number 1. At least modern weddings only make you sit with your weird cousins. You didn't have to watch the host's dog get better food than you. Joke number 2. Nobles sat closest to the salt, a luxury item, which gave rise to the phrase, worth your salt. Imagine your social worth depending on condiment placement. Joke number 3. If you misjudged your seat and sat too high up, you weren't just embarrassed, you might end up in jail for chair fraud. The punchline: forget the myth of togetherness. Upper-class medieval parties were more like high school cafeterias, where every seat screamed your status. Sit near the high table, and you were golden. Sit near the door, and you were basically medieval takeout. And remember that sour, spiced wine from earlier? Well, if you were stuck at the far end of the hall, you might never see a refill while the lord's dog enjoyed its third goblet. You imagine the knights at these parties looking like Hollywood extras, armor still gleaming from battle, helmets tossed aside, and hands tearing into turkey legs like action heroes at an all-you-can-eat buffet. The myth says these warriors were basically rock stars of the feast, strutting into the hall with fanfare and sitting wherever they pleased. But here's the flip: knights at banquets weren't the wild celebrities you picture. Their role was a lot more restrained, sometimes awkward, and occasionally downright disappointing. Mainstream fact first. Knights were often guests, but not always the stars of the show. Many knights served nobles and had to act with extreme deference at the table. They weren't swaggering in like movie characters. They were often assigned seats far from the high table, unless they'd achieved serious fame or status. So that image of a knight chomping loudly on a chicken leg while bragging about slaying dragons, more fantasy than fact. Now for the quirky tidbit. Knights at feasts sometimes had to provide entertainment instead of just eating. Yes, sword demonstrations, jousting reenactments, even storytelling. Imagine being hungry after a day in armor, only to be told, "Great, now do your comedy," set before dinner. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether knights were treated more like honored guests or glorified staff at these events. Some records suggest they were highly respected and given choice cuts of meat, while others paint them as glorified props used to show off the Lord's power. The truth probably depended on the knight's status and the Lord's mood. Joke number 1. If you expected knights to be medieval rock stars, think again. They were more like the party's unpaid open mic comedians. Joke number 2. Picture a knight carefully removing his helmet, only to reveal helmet hair worse than any 80s rock band. Joke number 3. Knights had strict table manners too. So if one dared belch after a sip of wine, that steel breastplate might not save him from side-eye. The punchline. Knights didn't eat like movie heroes. They often ate like background characters, performing tricks or quietly following the rules. So the myth of the heroic knight conquering the feast is as exaggerated as the dragons they supposedly fought. And remember those rigid seating charts from before. Even if you were a knight, you might still end up further from the salt than the Lord's hunting dog. Try telling that story with a straight face when you're supposed to be the noble warrior. You might think these feasts were the picture of elegant solemn halls, nobles sitting stiff-backed in silence, sipping politely, while harp-strings whispered in the background. The myth insists medieval upper-class parties were practically royal funerals with food, hushed voices, rigid etiquette, and everyone terrified of sneezing in the wrong direction. But here's the flip. Medieval banquets weren't quiet affairs at all. In fact, the noise could rival a frat party complete, with shouting, laughter, and enough background chaos to drown out your own thoughts. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval etiquette guides survive. And while they did emphasize manners, they also describe feasts as loud, bustling events. Servants rushed around, dogs barked under tables, musicians competed for attention, and guests shouted to be heard across the room. So instead of refined whispers, think more like a crowded sports bar with chandeliers. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some nobles actually hired jesters to run around during dinner, cracking jokes and performing tricks. One record even describes a jester juggling live animals at a feast. Imagine trying to eat your soup while a goose flaps past your head. So much for refined silence. And the debate. Historians still argue how rowdy things really got. Some believe noble banquets were rowdier than we assume, with drinking games and songs dominating the night. Others insist accounts of wild noise were exaggerated by critics of the nobility. Were they polite soirees or chaotic circuses? The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Joke number 1. If you thought dinner with your noisy relatives was bad, imagine eating venison stew while a guy in a jester hat does cartwheels into your chair. Joke number 2. Nobles sometimes threw scraps of food to their dogs under the table, basically the medieval version of a toddler hurling peas onto the floor. Joke number 3. With musicians, jesters, and chatter, the sound level was so high that if someone actually did sneeze, half the room probably applauded by accident. The punchline: forget stiff, silent dinners. Upper-class medieval parties were often sensory overloads, so noisy, chaotic, and crowded that calling them formal is like calling a rock concert quiet meditation. And remember those knights from the last section, stuck juggling between being entertainers and background props. Picture one trying to recite a heroic tale, only to be drowned out by a lute player, a barking dog, and a drunk noble belting a drinking song. So much for solemn dignity. You picture every dish steaming fresh from the kitchen, as if nobles had magical fridges and freezers hidden in the castle basement. The myth says upper-class parties featured only the freshest produce, the crispest bread, and the juiciest cuts of meat, basically farm to table, centuries before Instagram foodies made it trendy. But here's the flip: freshness wasn't guaranteed. In fact, preservation was often the name of the game, and some of the tricks nobles used would make you think twice about seconds. Let's start with the mainstream fact. Medieval cooks relied heavily on salted, dried, or pickled foods. Meat might be salted for weeks before it was served. Fish could be dried until it resembled medieval jerky, and bread could be baked days in advance. A fresh feast wasn't always fresh in the way you'd imagine. Now for the quirky tidbit: nobles sometimes used bizarre preservation hacks. For instance, fish might be stored alive in castle moats until needed. Yes, that moat around the castle wasn't just for defense, it doubled as an oversized refrigerator. Nothing says luxury like pointing out the window and saying, "Fetch me that trout, the one by the drawbridge." And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue about whether medieval nobles actually cared about freshness at all. Some suggest spices were used to disguise the taste of slightly off meat, while others argue nobles insisted on fresh kills whenever possible. Did they happily chew on days-old venison covered in cloves, or did they demand fresh game from their hunts? The evidence remains mixed. Joke number 1. Imagine fishing dinner out of your own moat, then realizing you just hooked the guard's laundry instead. Joke number 2. Nobles preserved fruit in honey, which sounds fancy until you realize it was basically the medieval version of a sticky Tupperware. Joke number 3. Salted meat was so common that biting into it must have felt like chewing on medieval beef jerky, great for the jaw muscles, terrible for dental care. The punchline: forget your fantasy of farm-fresh feasts. Upper-class parties often depended on salted, dried, or preserved foods that tasted more like survival rations than gourmet dining. And remember that noisy chaos from the last section. Imagine sitting in a rowdy hall while chewing on salted venison so tough you worried you'd need a blacksmith, not a dentist. Freshness, that was just wishful thinking. You probably see the scene in your mind: a banquet hall filled with the gentle strumming of harps, the occasional soft flute, and nobles nodding along politely, as though every party came with a built-in spa soundtrack. The myth says medieval upper-class entertainment was refined, soothing, and tastefully discreet. But here's the flip. Music and performance at these feasts could get downright rowdy, bizarre, and occasionally outrageous enough to make you spit out your soup. Mainstream fact. First, music was indeed central to noble parties, but it wasn't limited to delicate harp strings. Records show everything from bagpipes to drums to early fiddles, with musicians competing for attention over the roar of the crowd. Imagine trying to eat your salted venison while someone saws away on a fiddle right in your ear. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some nobles hired performers who didn't just play music, they staged full-on spectacles. Dancers might balance on tables. Jugglers hurled knives across the hall, and minstrels sometimes sang risk ballads that would have made your grandmother blush. One chronicler even describes trained bears leading processions into a feast because nothing says bon appétit like a bear lumbering past your stew. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this outrageous entertainment was common at all feasts or reserved for the most extravagant occasions. Some suggest wild shows were rare outliers, exaggerated by chroniclers, while others think nobles loved shocking their guests into awe. Were medieval feasts polite dinner parties or proto-circuses? The debate rages on. Joke number 1. Imagine a juggler accidentally dropping a knife into your gravy. Suddenly dinner turns into guess the mystery seasoning. Joke number 2. Trained bears as entertainment. That's not Cirque du Soleil, that's Cirque du asterisk so dash scary dash you dash spilled dash your dash wine. Joke number 3. Nobles sometimes requested Bodhi songs. So if Spotify existed back then, their dinner playlist would have come with a parental advisory warning. The punchline: forget harps and lullabies. Upper-class medieval parties were often a mix of chaos, comedy, and carnival, where the entertainment could be louder and wilder than the feast itself. And remember those preservation tricks from the last section. Imagine gnawing on a salted trout pulled out of a moat while a bear dances in front of you. Not exactly the elegant medieval spa night you were expecting. You probably imagine the nobility eating off gleaming gold platters, silver chalices sparkling under candlelight, and jewel-encrusted knives slicing delicate roasts. The myth says upper-class medieval parties were dripping with solid gold tableware, each meal like a treasure chest emptied onto the table. But here's the flip. Luxury tableware wasn't always what it seemed, and sometimes the gold was as fake as a plastic crown at a dollar store. Mainstream fact. Yes, nobles did use precious metals for their dishes, but not nearly as often as you'd think. Most tableware was made of pewter, wood, or ceramics, with gold and silver trotted out only for truly special occasions. Everyday feasts were less treasure hoard and more nice but practical dinnerware. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some nobles coated cheaper pewter or wood plates with a thin layer of gold leaf to pretend they had golden dishes. Guests might admire the sparkle, unaware that the golden platter was basically a medieval knockoff. Think of it as the 14th century version of renting a luxury car just to impress your date. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue about whether nobles used precious metal plates more for dining or more for display. Some suggest golden dishes were never actually eaten from, they were props to show off wealth, while the actual food was served on humbler wares. Others argue nobles really did dine from them, risking tarnished flavors and toothaches. Was it all display, or was it genuine dining luxury? The experts haven't settled it. Joke number 1. Imagine eating greasy venison stew from a golden platter by the end of the night. It's basically gilded leftovers. Joke number 2. If nobles had Instagram, you know they'd post #GoldenDinner, but crop out the wooden spoon in their hand. Joke number 3. Nothing says wealth like serving pickled cabbage out of a silver bowl. The punchline: medieval luxury was as much about appearances as reality. Sure, the hall might glitter with golden plates, but more often than not, it was clever staging props to convince everyone the host's wealth was endless, even if the servants were scrubbing stew off wooden trenchers in the kitchen. And remember that dancing bear from the last section. Imagine it lumbering past while you pretend to sip from a golden chalice, praying no one notices the chipped pewter mug hidden under your napkin. You picture refined nobles sipping their wine with pinkies out, never letting a drop spill. Their self-control so impressive it puts modern dinner parties to shame. The myth says everyone at these banquets remained dignified, sober, and perfectly composed even after hours of toasting. But here's the flip. Medieval upper-class parties could get downright messy. By the end of the night, some guests were more likely to be wobbling under the table than discussing poetry. Mainstream fact: alcohol was everywhere at these feasts. Whether it was wine in the south, ale in the north, or mead, fermented honey. Across the board, nobles drank throughout the meal. Since drinking water wasn't safe, alcohol was the standard, so staying sober wasn't exactly the goal. Accounts describe nobles getting very loud, very red-faced, and occasionally falling asleep right at the table. Quirky tidbit: some nobles turned drinking into contests. Records describe drinking games where guests competed to down the largest cup or stay upright the longest. One story tells of a noble who passed out so hard at the table that servants quietly cleared the food around him and just kept the party going. Imagine waking up surrounded by empty platters and wondering if you dreamed dinner. And the scholarly debate: historians still argue whether drunken behavior was frowned upon or expected. Some etiquette manuals warn against excessive drinking, while other chronicles gleefully report drunken antics as if they were highlights of the feast. Was tipsiness shameful, or was it just part of the fun? Scholars can't agree. Joke number 1. Imagine a noble trying to give a serious toast, only to hiccup halfway through and declare his undying love to a roast chicken. Joke number 2. Drinking games sometimes ended with nobles sleeping on the floor. So yes, medieval slumber parties were BYO pillow. Joke number 3. Servants sometimes had to drag drunken guests out of the hall, so basically medieval Uber, but without the 5-star rating. The punchline: while myths claim sober elegance, the reality is that noble feasts often tipped into controlled chaos where dignity went out the window after the 3rd goblet. And remember those fake golden plates from the last section. Imagine trying to look classy sipping from a gilded cup, only to immediately spill your wine vinegary Gatorade all over your neighbor's velvet sleeves. Dignified? Not exactly. You might picture nobles throwing feasts just for fun. Parties meant purely for laughter, dancing, and indulgence, like medieval versions of Vegas weekends. The myth says these gatherings were carefree escapes from politics, a chance for the wealthy to relax and forget their troubles. But here's the flip. Upper-class parties weren't just about pleasure. More often than not, they were staged as political theater, with every toast, seating arrangement, and course of food carrying messages sharper than any sword. Mainstream fact: feasts were tools of power. Hosting a massive banquet proved your wealth and influence, reinforced alliances, and sometimes intimidated rivals. A noble didn't just invite you to eat, they invited you to witness how much money they could burn on sugar sculptures, spiced wines, and armies of servants. Think less party and more corporate flex with snacks. Now for the quirky tidbit. Nobles sometimes served food in symbolic shapes. For example, meat might be molded into castles, lions, or crowns, mini edible propaganda pieces that whispered, "See this roast swan." It's a metaphor for me ruling you. Guests weren't just chewing dinner, they were swallowing political statements. And the debate. Historians still argue whether feasts were primarily about genuine hospitality or pure power games. Some sources emphasize camaraderie and generosity, while others highlight manipulation and politics woven into every bite. Were banquets acts of friendship or acts of dominance? The answer changes depending on which dusty parchment you read. Joke number 1. Picture being invited to a party, biting into a pastry castle, and realizing you're literally chewing on your host's ego. Joke number 2. Nobles used sugar sculptures to brag wealth, basically medieval edible NFTs that melted before dessert was over. Joke number 3. If you thought corporate dinners today are awkward, imagine being forced to clap politely as your boss's roast beef is paraded into the hall shaped like a lion. The punchline: far from innocent entertainment, upper-class medieval parties were chess matches disguised as dinner. Every laugh, toast, and dish carried weight, turning the dining hall into a stage where power was served alongside stew. And remember the drunken nobles from the last section. Now imagine one blurting out the wrong political opinion in the middle of a toast. That wasn't just embarrassing, that could end in exile. Suddenly, the feast doesn't feel so carefree anymore. You probably assume medieval food was plain, dull, and practically unseasoned, like endless porridge with a side of boiled sadness. The myth says nobles sat through bland meals, eating little more than gray stews and unflavored bread. But here's the flip. Medieval upper-class parties were spice explosions. In fact, nobles prized bold flavors so much that their kitchens sometimes went overboard, turning dinners into tongue-numbing experiments. Mainstream fact: spices were the ultimate luxury item in medieval Europe. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron were imported from Asia at enormous cost. Having heavily spiced dishes on the table wasn't just about taste, it was about flaunting your wealth. A single dash of saffron could cost as much as a farm animal. So when nobles dumped spices into their stews, they were basically seasoning with dollar bills. Quirky tidbit: nobles even used spices in bizarre ways. One recipe calls for chicken stewed with sugar and cinnamon, basically medieval dessert chicken. Another describes bright green sauces made with parsley and ginger, creating dishes that looked more like paint samples than food. Imagine your host proudly serving neon stew while insisting it's all the rage in Paris. And the scholarly debate: historians still argue whether spices were truly used to cover up spoiled meat. Some claim heavy seasoning was a practical way to disguise less than fresh flavors, while others say spices were far too expensive to waste on bad food. Were nobles hiding rot or just showing off? The debate lingers, like the aftertaste of clove-stuffed venison. Joke number 1. Picture a noble so spice-obsessed that biting into his stew feels like gargling pumpkin spice latte concentrate. Joke number 2. Saffron was worth its weight in gold, so losing your spice pouch was basically dropping your medieval Bitcoin wallet. Joke number 3. Nobles sometimes combined sugar and meat so aggressively that you'd think a toddler was in charge of the recipe book. The punchline: forget bland porridge. Upper-class medieval parties were more like medieval hot sauce challenges dishes drenched in spices, partly for taste, mostly for flexing. And remember those edible propaganda sculptures from the last section. Now imagine one of them dusted in cinnamon sugar, daring you to decide if you're eating art, dinner, or dessert. You probably picture peasants peering through castle windows, noses pressed to the glass, forever denied a taste of noble luxury. The myth says only the rich ever touched fine foods. Peasants doomed to gruel, while nobles dined on swans and spice. But here's the flip. While nobles had exclusive access most of the time, peasants and townsfolk occasionally slipped into the world of luxury, sometimes by accident, sometimes by loophole, sometimes by outright rebellion. Mainstream fact. During major religious festivals and public celebrations, nobles often opened their feasts to commoners, at least partially. Leftovers might be handed out, or lower classes might be invited to eat in adjoining spaces. Think of it as medieval catering, but you got the scraps after the main party was done. Quirky tidbit: peasants sometimes crashed noble parties, literally. One account describes villagers storming a feast after a dispute, seizing food and drink in the chaos. Imagine medieval wedding crashers, but instead of awkward dancing, they left carrying an entire roasted pig. And the scholarly debate: historians still argue how often common folk had access to noble foods. Some believe it was rare, limited to scraps and symbolic gestures, while others suggest feasts were more socially mixed than we assume, especially in town festivals. Were peasants really excluded, or did nobles occasionally throw them a bone, sometimes literally? The truth remains fuzzy. Joke number 1. Imagine standing in line for leftover noble food and getting a handful of cold pea porridge. 5-star dining at its finest. Joke number 2. Peasants sometimes managed to taste spices, so biting into clove-stuffed chicken might have felt like winning the medieval lottery. Joke number 3. When peasants stormed a feast, it was basically the original all-you-can-eat buffet hack. The punchline: while luxury was mostly for nobles, peasants weren't completely locked out. Sometimes they shared in the feast, sometimes they barged in, and sometimes they left with more roast goose than the host bargained for. And remember the spice-soaked dessert chicken from the last section. Imagine a peasant grabbing that dish during a food raid, taking one bite, then wondering if the nobles were geniuses or just terrible cooks. You probably imagine every noble feast ending on a high note, full bellies, laughter echoing through the hall, music fading into gentle night, and everyone stumbling off to bed in perfect satisfaction. The myth says these parties were joyful escapes, moments of carefree indulgence without consequence. But here's the flip. not every feast ended in bliss. Some left behind political grudges, financial ruin, or even physical danger that lingered long after the last toast. Mainstream fact: banquets could bankrupt a host. Nobles often spent staggering amounts to impress guests, sometimes blowing years of income on one extravagant event. Hosting a feast wasn't always about generosity, could be financial self-sabotage. Imagine spending your life savings just to one-up your neighbor's last dinner party. Quirky tidbit: feasts sometimes ended in literal food fights. Chronicles describe nobles flinging bread or bones across the table when tempers flared. And yes, knives occasionally got involved, which is less fun food fight and more HR nightmare with gravy. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians argue whether feasts strengthened social bonds or planted seeds of discord. Some accounts show alliances forged over shared meals, while others tell of insults, drunken slips, or rivalries made worse by extravagant displays. Did feasts unify or divide? The truth depends on whose diary you believe. Joke number 1. Imagine throwing a banquet so expensive that the next morning you're not hungover, you're financially hungover. Joke number 2. Nobles used food as insults, so if someone hurled a chicken leg at you, congratulations, that's medieval shade. Joke number 3. Sometimes party mishaps ended in duels, proving the only thing sharper than a noble's knife was his ego. The punchline: feasts weren't always joyful escapes. Sometimes they ended with tension simmering as hot as the soup, or debts piling higher than the platters. Behind the glitter and noise, every noble guest left carrying more than just a full stomach. And remember those peasants sneaking bites of luxury from the last section. Sometimes they probably had the last laugh sleeping soundly while the nobles lay awake calculating their losses. And now, as the last echoes of music fade and the candles burn low, you let the noise of the feast slip into memory. The hall grows quiet, the laughter replaced by the creak of benches being pushed back, the rustle of cloaks, and the distant hoot of an owl outside. The long tables, once piled with food, now sit cluttered with crumbs, tipped goblets, and half-burned wax drippings. Slowly, servants move through the hall, clearing away what remains, their steps soft on the stone floor. You breathe a little slower now, imagining yourself drifting out of the crowded room and into the cool night air. The torchlight flickers along castle walls, and above, the stars scatter across the dark sky. The energy of the feast lingers faintly, like smoke, but it no longer presses against you. The chaos, the clamor, the constant motion all soften into silence. With each step, the images blur golden plates that were sometimes fake, goblets filled with sour wine, jesters tumbling, and nobles arguing fade into a distant dream. The myths we unraveled tonight settle into gentle truths, the kind that remind you history isn't always the grand story we imagine, but something far messier, stranger, and more human. As you close your eyes, you might still hear faint echoes left, mixing with the clink of pewter mugs, the shuffle of dogs underfoot, or maybe just the quiet sigh of a jester tired of juggling geese. It all drifts into calm now, leaving you lighter, as if the party finally ended and rest has taken its place. So let the last torch go out, let the great hall empty, and let yourself drift into sleep, carrying only the soft comfort of knowing the truth behind the legend.